A young Temujin brutally took the life of his own brother. He was his rival and had to be eliminated. However, not long after, he found a new one, Jamukha. The two were as thick as thieves and soon became best friends. But that wasn't enough, and so they swore a sacred pact, making them blood brothers. They vowed to take on the world together, and for a time, they did. A few years later, now men, although teenagers still, things started to change. They were both respected warriors and allies, but their love for each other had long faded, and in its place, the seeds of resentment were starting to sprout. And thus, a storm was brewing, and these two brothers were set to clash. Like two tornadoes, they gathered momentum, and warlords from all over were forced to pick a side. They were on a collision course, and nothing was going to stop it. But before we get into the devastating details of the clash, let's delve into the unfortunate circumstances that led to this battle of brothers. As a teenager, Temujin sat in his tent, surrounded by his wife, his family, and his warriors. He felt on top of the world. He'd just won his first real war campaign and had annihilated one of the Mongol tribe's greatest enemies, the Merkits. The name Temujin was spreading like wildfire across the steppes to every corner of their world. He was on track to becoming one of the greatest warlords Mongolia had ever seen. However, as the world celebrated Temujin, his best friend and blood brother, Jamukha, sulked. Like a scorned ex-wife, jealousy consumed him. After all, he had helped Temujin win the campaign against the Merkits. He'd lent him 10,000 of his best warriors when Temujin had nothing. But, for some reason, nobody seemed to care, least of all Temujin. That's how Jamukha felt anyway. Betrayed. He realised that if he doesn't act fast, Temujin will become too powerful to be stopped. It didn't matter that years before, when they were mere youths, they swore the sacred and a pact, a blood pact where two men pledge allegiance to each other and become brothers. Since then, their relationship had grown rocky, with the two of them arguing about who should lead the army in the Merkit campaign. But after the campaign, they'd reforged their pact and everything seemed fine. On the surface anyway. Behind the scenes, Jamukha's jealousy overwhelmed him. Like a raging furnace burning within, it grew and grew until it became too much, and he did the unthinkable. One cold winter night, he decided to take a trip. The surviving Merkit Confederation was beginning to regroup in some far corners of the steppes. Upon hearing this news, Jamukha decided to give his old enemies a visit. After a perilous journey alone through the rocky lands of northern Mongolia, Jamukha arrived. The Merkits greeted him with suspicion, but he demanded to speak to their leader and was permitted entry to the camp. They were now poor, disgraced, and hated the Mongol tribes more than ever before. Which means, when Jamukha proposed a deal, one that would involve the removal of Temujin's head, they agreed. Meanwhile, Temujin continued to gather strength. Many warriors from all over were flocking to his cause. They believed he was their Khan, the supreme leader. His wife Bort also played an instrumental role in his ascent. She advised him that Jamukha was likely to betray him and that he should cut ties with him. Temujin agreed. At this point, both Temujin and Jamukha were plotting against each other. Jamukha, who was already an established warlord, was losing many of his warriors to Temujin's cause, which is why he hurried, scurrying all over the steppes, gathering men to his side. Meanwhile, Temujin, although a lesser chieftain, was gaining momentum. The reason behind Temujin's rapid rise was that he offered something new, something exciting, which is what scared Jamukha. There had never been one supreme ruler of the Mongols, and many liked the idea. After all, who wouldn't want to be led by someone as charismatic and charming as Temujin? On the other hand though, Jamukha was a traditionalist. He and his aristocratic friends wanted to keep things the way they were, in other words, to remain in power. They had to stop Temujin, no matter the cost, and thus the two sides prepared for a massive battle. While Jamukha was travelling from tribe to tribe gathering support, Temujin did nothing. He was like a magnet, and warriors from all over the land flocked to him. By this time, Jamukha and Temujin were openly hostile with each other. The storm was gathering momentum, and their men, once united, had to pick a side. 10,000 of Jamukha's best warriors, including 41 tribal chiefs, deserted him and joined Temujin, declaring him Khan. He feared more would soon join them, and so he prepared for battle. He had to put an end to Temujin before it was too late. However, Jamukha was still a well-known war chief and easily gathered support from other established tribes, like the Taichud, one of the three major Mongol clans. Fearing Temujin's rise, traditionalists flocked to Jamukha, but the new generation of Mongols sought out Temujin. In no time, the two of them had armies totaling around 30,000 men each, and were evenly matched, and the day of the battle grew ever nearer. If you're enjoying this so far, please like and subscribe. Now, back to the battle. Since these two armies were nomadic, they rarely ever stopped moving, making planning a battle quite difficult. In the end, the day finally came. Temujin and his army had stopped and made camp. They knew that Jamukha was in the south and was preparing for an attack from that direction. However, Jamukha knew that facing Temujin's warriors head-on was a bad idea, so he planned a surprise attack. He left a small force behind and took the bulk of his army north, flanking Temujin's forces. A scout from Temujin's army immediately noticed the deception and rode like the wind to warn his Khan. When he finally arrived, he flung Temujin's tent open and warned him, and so the battle begun. Temujin's warriors grabbed their weapons, leaped onto their horses and braced themselves for the clash. These two blood brothers turned rivals were about to get their chance to prove who deserved to lead. Arrows flew, horses galloped and swords sliced. The forces were evenly matched, but Jamukha's surprise attack worked. He was winning. Temujin fought in a furious rage. He was young but deadly. Still, his ferocity didn't change the fact that Jamukha's experienced army was winning, and they were losing ground. Although a warrior through and through, Temujin was never one to throw his life away. Hence, he screamed for his men to retreat, and they did. You see, although Jamukha had sprung a surprise attack, Temujin had picked the location of the battle, and he always had a plan B. He and his warriors rode like the wind away from their attackers, straight towards the Onon River. It wasn't the river that saved them though, it was a tight mountain pass called Jareen they were aiming for. Jamukha, realising his rival's plan, charged forth, desperate to catch them before they made it. But Temujin's younger men were too fast. They made it to the pass just in time and quickly set up a defensive position. It served as a natural fortress. Attacking it was suicide, and so Jamukha's advance was halted. The battle was over. Jamukha had won, but Temujin and the bulk of his army had survived. This angered Jamukha greatly, and in his rage he brutally tortured all of his captives, which in the end would be his undoing. As for Temujin, before he'd get his chance at revenge, he had to run. He was now a fugitive. Although he still had many loyal men left, he'd been defeated, disgraced. Plus, Jamukha was after him. So he made the decision to take his family and go south into China. He told his warriors that he'd be back, and for a few years, he disappeared. Meanwhile, following his victory, Jamukha's power went to his head, and he became a vicious warlord, harming both friends and foes. slowly turning his people against him. While he was busy being hated, Temujin started a new chapter, one that involved him becoming a servant to one of the Mongols' sworn enemies. Temujin and Jamukha's story is far from over, and this was one of only many battles to come. Over a decade later, they'd meet for one final fight. But before that, Jamukha would come begging for Temujin's help. But we'll cover those stories next time. If you enjoyed this piece of Mongol history, be sure to click on one of the cards on screen for more.